The Yukon Territorial Mail Service has me listed as the postmaster of the Glenmore branch from October of the previous year through the present. The previous postmaster, Eileen Drysdale, has me listed in her personal calendar as having taken over the position on September 28th, 2 weeks earlier than the official transfer date. The trapper who lives 12 kilometers from the post office, a man named Reginald Coombs, has me listed in his own informal records as having been at the post office on September 14th, which was 3 days before I had even accepted the job offer and 4 weeks before the official transfer. All 3 records cannot be correct. At least 2 of them are wrong. I have been trying for the past 7 months to determine which 2. I am 39 years old. I took the postmaster position at the Glenmore branch, which serves a small dispersed community of about 90 year-round residents in a remote part of the southern Yukon after my partner died of cancer in May of the previous year, and I needed to leave the city we had been living in. The job had been advertised through a federal employment site that listed remote government positions in the territories. The pay was modest. The position came with a small attached residence above the post office building. The community was quiet. The work was straightforward. The relocation was paid for by the Federal Mail Service. The position seemed like a way to start over in a place where I would not constantly be reminded of the life I had been living before. I am recording this account because Reginald Coombs died last week of a heart attack. Yet while running his trap line in the country east of the post office. His body was found by a neighbor who had been driving through the area and had seen Reginald's truck parked off the road. Reginald was 67 years old. He had no immediate family. His belongings, including the small notebooks he had used to track his trapline activities and his interactions with his neighbors over the decades, were turned over to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who released them to me last week because Reginald had named me as the recipient of his personal effects in a handwritten will that was found in his cabin. I have spent the past week going through Reginald's notebooks. The notebooks have provided me with information I did not have during the months Reginald was alive. And the information has changed my understanding of what has been happening at the post office since I arrived. I am recording this account because I believe the recording needs to exist in case the situation continues after I leave the position, which I am planning to do at the end of the current fiscal year. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I'm asking because the events I am about to describe occurred at irregular hours throughout the past 7 months, and I have come to think the timing matters in ways I have not yet been able to fully understand. I want to start with the official version of how I came to be at the post office, because the official version is the one that is documented in the Territorial Mail Service's records and in my own correspondence with the Federal Hiring Office. And I want to give you the official version first, and then I want to give you the alternative versions that have emerged from Eileen's calendar and from Reginald's notebooks. The differences between the versions are the place where the story actually starts. According to the Territorial Mail Service, I applied for the Glenmore postmaster position on August 14th of the previous year. I had a phone interview on August 22nd. I was offered the position on September 17th. I accepted the offer on September 19th. I signed the employment contract on September 24th. I arrived at the post office on October 11th, after a 4-day drive from the city where I had been living. I was given a 1-week orientation by Eileen Drysdale, the previous postmaster, who had retired after 23 years in the position. The orientation ended on October 18th. Eileen left the community on October 19th. I assumed full responsibility for the post office on October 20th, which was the official transfer date. This is the version that appears in the federal records. This is the version that I have been telling people when they have asked since I arrived. This is the version I had been telling myself, in the sense that I had no reason to question it until the past few weeks. Eileen Drysdale lives in a small town about 300 kilometers south of Glenmore now, in retirement. She had given me her phone number on the day she left, in case I had any questions about the position. I had called her 3 times in my first month, with practical questions about specific procedures that the orientation had not adequately covered. She had been helpful and responsive. She had told me she was happy to be reached any time. I called her in late February of this year, about 4 months after I had taken over the position, to ask about a particular registered mail procedure that had come up. We talked for about 20 minutes. At the end of the conversation, in the way you do when you are wrapping up a phone call, Eileen said, "It's been good talking to you, Margaret. I have been thinking about you. It's hard to believe you've been there almost 5 months now." I told her it had only been 4 months. She said, "Has it really only been 4 months? It feels longer. I have you in my calendar as starting on September 28th. That would make it 5 months." I told her September 28th was not when I had started. I told her the official transfer date had been October 20th. But I told her I had not even been in Glenmore on September 28th, that I had still been in the city packing my things and finalizing my move. Eileen was quiet for a moment. She said, "That is strange. I have a calendar entry for September 28th that says, 'Margaret arrives.' I remember writing it. I remember showing you around the post office that day. I remember we walked through the building and I introduced you to the back office and to the storage areas. I remember we had tea together in my apartment afterward." I told her none of that had happened on September 28th. I told her she must be remembering October 11th, when I had actually arrived, and that her calendar was probably wrong. Eileen said she would check her calendar more carefully and would call me back. We hung up. She called me back the next day. She told me she had reviewed her calendar in detail. The September 28th entry was clearly written. There was no October 11th entry. There was no entry for any other arrival date for me. The September 28th entry was the only entry related to my arrival, and it described a visit that, by her recollection, had included specific details that she could still remember in detail. She said, "Margaret, I am going to ask you a hard question. Are you certain you did not visit the post office before the official transfer date? Did you possibly drive up for an unofficial visit to look at the place before you committed to moving? Some people do that. It would not have been a problem. I would have been happy to show you around early." I told her I had not visited before the transfer date. I told her I had committed to the move based on phone conversations and the photographs the federal office had sent me. I told her my financial situation after my partner's death had not allowed me to make exploratory trips to potential job locations. I told her the 4-day drive in October had been my first time in the Yukon territory in my life. Eileen was quiet for a long time. She said, "Margaret, I am sure you are telling me the truth. I am also sure that I have a clear memory of you arriving on September 28th and of us spending the day together at the post office. I do not know how to reconcile these two things. I want to think about it. Can I call you back?" She did not call me back. I called her 2 days later. She did not pick up. I called her again the following week. She did not pick up. I have not spoken with her since, and I have considered driving to her town to see her in person, but I have not done so. I do not know whether she is avoiding me because she is embarrassed about the calendar entry, or because she has remembered something else that has disturbed her, or because something else has happened. I have decided to leave her alone unless I have a specific reason to contact her. I want to tell you about the post office building because the building is the location of the events I am describing, and the layout matters. The post office is a small wooden structure built in 1962. The building has a public area at the front, with a counter and a wall of post office boxes behind which the residents of the community can collect their mail. Behind the public area is a back office, which contains a sorting room, a small storage area for packages and undelivered items, a tiny bathroom, and a door that leads to a basement. The basement is unfinished, with a packed dirt floor, concrete walls, and a low ceiling. The basement contains the building's utility systems and a few storage shelves where decades of accumulated postal records have been kept. Above the post office, accessible by an exterior staircase on the side of the building, is the postmaster's residence. The residence is a small 2-bedroom apartment with a kitchen, a bathroom, and a living room. The residence has its own entrance and is separate from the post office's interior. I live in the residence. The post office serves the community of Glenmore, which is dispersed across a wide area in the river valley. Most of the residents have post office boxes that they check once or twice a week when they come into the small commercial center where the post office is located. The commercial center includes the post office, a small general store, a fuel station, and a community hall. The center is the main gathering point for the community, though there is no town in the conventional sense. The residents live on properties scattered across the valley and into the surrounding hills. I want to tell you about Reginald Coombs because he is the second voice in this account, and because his observations have become important. Reginald was a trapper who had lived in the Glenmore area for approximately 40 years. He ran a trap line in the country east of the post office, primarily for marten and lynx, and supplemented his income with seasonal work for the local outfitter and with a small federal pension. He was a quiet man. He came into the post office every Tuesday afternoon to collect his mail and to buy a few items at the general store. He had a beard that had been gray for as long as I had known him, which was the entire 7 months I had been in Glenmore. He spoke carefully when he spoke at all. He had not been particularly friendly with me when I first arrived, but he had not been unfriendly either. He had been the kind of person who acknowledged me with a nod when he came in and who left without much conversation. In late November of my first year at the post office, about 6 weeks after I arrived, Reginald came in on a Tuesday afternoon to collect his mail. He had 3 letters and a small package, and he took them from the counter where I had set them out for him. He started to leave. Then he stopped. He turned back to the counter. He looked at me for a few seconds without speaking. He said, "Margaret, can I ask you a question?" I told him he could. He said, "When did you actually start working here?" I told him October 20th was the official transfer date. I told him I had been at the post office for an orientation week before that, starting October 11th. Reginald nodded slowly. He said, "I want to mention something to you. I do not want to make a big deal of it. I have been wondering whether to mention it for several weeks. I have decided that I should mention it because I think you should know." I told him to go ahead. He said, "I came into the post office on September 14th. And I came in to pick up a package that I had been expecting. Eileen was not at the counter. There was a woman at the counter who I did not recognize. The woman was about your age. The woman had hair the same color as yours. The woman was wearing what I would describe as your kind of clothes, although I cannot give you specific details about the clothes because I was not paying close attention to them at the time. The woman gave me my package. She was friendly. She introduced herself to me. She said her name was Margaret. She said she was the new postmaster. She said Eileen had asked her to cover the counter while Eileen was in the back. I did not think much of it at the time. I assumed Eileen had hired her replacement and was training her early. I came back the following Tuesday and Eileen was at the counter and Margaret was not. As I did not ask Eileen about it, I assumed Margaret had been temporary, or had worked specific hours, and that Eileen would be at the counter most of the time. He paused. He said, "When you arrived in October, I recognized you immediately. You are the woman who was at the counter on September 14th. I did not say anything because I assumed there was a scheduling explanation that I did not understand. But you have just told me you were not in Glenmore before October 11th. I am telling you this because I have been thinking about it for 6 weeks, and I do not have a way to make it make sense in my own mind. I am not telling you because I think you are lying. I am telling you because I think you should know that I saw you here on September 14th, and that you spoke to me, and that you handed me a package, and that you introduced yourself." Bess, I sat at the counter and I tried to process what Reginald was telling me. He was the second person, after Eileen, to describe my presence at the post office before I had been in Glenmore. The two accounts did not match each other on the date. Eileen had said September 28th. Reginald was saying September 14th. The accounts both contradicted my own knowledge of where I had been during those weeks. I had been in the city, working out the final weeks of my previous job and packing my apartment for the move. I had records to verify my location during those weeks, including credit card transactions, building access records from my old apartment, and emails to colleagues at my previous employer. I asked Reginald whether he was certain about the date. He said, "Yes, I am certain about the date because I had been waiting for the package for 2 weeks. The package was a part for my generator. I had ordered it from Whitehorse. The tracking number had told me it had arrived on September 13th, but the post office had been closed when I went by that day. I went back the next morning. The next morning was September 14th. I have a habit of writing down the days I pick up packages because I have had disputes with the shipping company in the past about delivery times. I wrote down September 14th in my notebook. I have the notebook at home. I can verify the date if you want." I told him I would appreciate it if he could verify the date. He said he would bring his notebook the following Tuesday. He left. I stood at the counter after he left and I tried to think. I considered the possibility that Reginald was misremembering or that he was confusing me with someone else. Reginald did not strike me as a person who was prone to confusion. He was 67 years old, but he was alert and precise in the conversations I had had with him. He had described the woman at the counter in detail that matched me. He had described the encounter in detail that suggested he had a clear memory of it. I considered the possibility that the Federal Mail Service had hired a temporary worker to cover the counter during a period when Eileen had been unable to work, and that the temporary worker had happened to share my first name and to resemble me physically. I considered this possibility and rejected it. The Federal Mail Service did not hire temporary workers for small remote post offices. The procedure for covering a postmaster's absence in a community like Glenmore was to close the post office for the duration of the absence and to redirect mail to the nearest larger post office, which was about 200 kilometers away. The federal records would have shown a temporary closure if Eileen had been unable to work. The records did not show one. I considered the possibility that Reginald and Eileen had both fabricated their accounts, perhaps as part of some kind of community joke or test of the new postmaster. I considered this possibility and rejected it. Eileen lived 300 kilometers away and had no contact with Reginald that I was aware of. The two of them could not have coordinated their accounts even if they had wanted to. The contradictions between their dates suggested that they had not coordinated. Yet the remaining possibility was the one I did not want to consider. The remaining possibility was that the accounts were accurate, that someone who looked like me had been at the post office on September 14th and again on September 28th, and that the someone had presented themselves as Margaret, the new postmaster. I did not know what to do with this possibility. I decided to wait for Reginald's notebook before I made any further decisions. Reginald came in the following Tuesday with his notebook. The notebook was a small spiral-bound book, the kind you would buy at a hardware store. He opened it on the counter and turned it so I could see the relevant page. The page was dated in the upper corner. The date was September 14th. The entry was brief. It said, "Picked up generator part from P.O. New postmaster Margaret on counter. That Eileen training her in back. Friendly, will come back Tuesday." I read the entry. The handwriting was Reginald's. The pen was the same blue ink that he used in the rest of his notebook entries, which I could see on the surrounding pages. The entry was, by every visible characteristic, written on September 14th and not added later. I asked Reginald whether the notebook had been with him continuously since September 14th. I was thinking about whether the entry could have been added recently as part of some kind of deception. He said the notebook had been with him in his cabin since September 14th. He said the notebook went with him to the post office every Tuesday and otherwise stayed in a drawer in his kitchen. He said he had not made any modifications to the entry since he had written it, and that he said I was welcome to take the notebook to a forensic examiner if I wanted to verify the age of the ink. I told him I did not need to verify the ink. I told him I believed him about the date. I asked him whether he had any other notebook entries that referenced the woman he had seen. He said he did not. He said the September 14th entry was the only entry that mentioned her. I asked him if he would be willing to write down a more detailed description of the woman he had seen, in case the description became useful later. He agreed. He took out a pen. He wrote a description on a fresh page of his notebook. He tore the page out and gave it to me. The description was about a paragraph long. It described a woman in her late 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair, of average height and build, wearing a dark sweater and jeans. Yet the description noted that the woman had a small mole on the left side of her chin. The description said the woman had a calm voice and had been polite and efficient. "I have a small mole on the left side of my chin." The description matched me. I thanked Reginald for the description. I put the page in a folder in my office. Reginald collected his mail. He left. That night, I sat in my apartment above the post office, and I tried to think about what I had learned. I had 2 accounts of my presence at the post office before I had arrived. The accounts were from 2 different witnesses, were on 2 different dates, and were consistent in describing a woman who matched my appearance. The accounts contradicted my own records of my location during those weeks. The accounts were impossible by any reasonable explanation. I started a notebook of my own that night. I wrote down what Eileen had told me on the phone. I wrote down what Reginald had told me at the counter. I wrote down the contradiction in the dates. I wrote down the matching descriptions. I wrote down my own verifiable activities during the weeks in question, with references to the records that supported my whereabouts. I wrote down everything I could think of that might be relevant. I have continued the notebook since then. The notebook is now about 100 pages long. The notebook contains entries from December through May, documenting additional encounters and conversations that have added to the picture I am trying to construct. I am going to use the notebook to give you the rest of the story because the notebook is more reliable than my unaided memory at this point. The next significant entry in the notebook is from January 8th. The entry describes a conversation I had with the owner of the general store, a man named Donald Pettigrew. Donald is in his early 70s. He has run the general store in Glenmore for over 30 years. He knows everyone in the community. He had been friendly with me since I arrived, but had not, until January, said anything to me that suggested he had any unusual observations about my time in Glenmore. On January 8th, I was in the general store buying groceries. Donald was at the counter. We were talking about the weather, which had been unusually cold for several days. The conversation moved to other topics. Donald asked me how I was settling in. He asked me whether I was getting used to the community. He asked me whether I had been making friends. And I told him I was settling in well. I told him the work was straightforward. I told him I had been keeping mostly to myself in the evenings, working on personal projects, but that I was starting to become familiar with the regular customers at the post office. Donald nodded. He said, "Margaret, I want to ask you something. I have been wondering about it for a few weeks. I do not want to make you uncomfortable. I am asking because I am curious." I told him to ask. He said, "Do you have a sister?" I told him I did not. I told him I was an only child. My parents had both passed away years ago. I had no siblings, no first cousins, no close family of any kind. Donald said, "I am asking because I have seen a woman in the area who looks very similar to you. I have seen her 3 times in the past 2 months. I have seen her at a distance, mostly driving past the store on the road that leads up the valley. I have seen her once up close, when she came into the store to buy a coffee. She did not introduce herself. She did not stay long. I assumed she was a relative of yours who was visiting. The resemblance was strong enough that I did not think to question it at the time. I am asking now because I have not seen you mention any visiting family, and because I have been wondering whether the woman might be someone else." I asked him to describe the woman. He gave me a description. The description matched my own appearance. He noted, as Reginald had, the small mole on the left side of my chin. He said the woman had been wearing different clothing each time he had seen her. He said the woman had not, in his interactions with her, and been unfriendly or unusual in any way that would have raised his suspicion at the time. I asked him when he had seen her up close. He said, "About 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember it was a Tuesday because I had just finished restocking the shelves, which I do on Tuesday mornings, and I was sitting at the counter eating my lunch when she came in. A Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks before January 8th. Would have been around December 17th or 18th. I had been at the post office on both of those Tuesdays. I had records to verify my presence at the post office, including transactions in the postal system that could only have been processed by me. I told Donald that I had not been at the store on those Tuesday afternoons. I told him I had been at the post office. I asked him whether he was certain about the timing. He said he was certain. He said he had not been mistaken about the day or the woman. I left the store that afternoon with my groceries. I went back to my apartment. I added the conversation with Donald to my notebook. I had now had 3 witnesses describe a woman who looked like me, with the specific detail of the mole on my chin, in different locations in Glenmore at different times. I want to tell you what happened next, because the next entry in my notebook is the one where the situation began to escalate beyond the question of whether someone who looked like me had been visiting the community. The next entry is from February 3rd. The entry describes a conversation I had with the dispatcher at the regional medical clinic, which is located in a small town about 150 kilometers from Glenmore, and the clinic serves the Glenmore community for any medical needs that cannot be handled by the visiting nurse who comes to Glenmore once a month. I had called the clinic that morning to schedule an appointment for a routine physical. The dispatcher who took my call was a woman named Sandra. Sandra had been the dispatcher at the clinic for many years, by her own description. She knew the residents of the small communities in the region and was familiar with most of them by name and voice. I gave Sandra my name. I told her I needed to schedule a physical. Sandra paused. She said, "Margaret Halverson, from Glenmore?" I told her yes. She said, "I am looking at your file. I see you came in for a visit on January 22nd. The visit was with Dr. Penrose. As the notes say, you came in for a follow-up on a prescription that he had given you the previous month. I told her I had not been to the clinic in January. I told her I had not been to the clinic at any point since arriving in Glenmore in October. I told her I had not been seen by Dr. Penrose at any time. I told her I did not have any prescriptions from the clinic. Sandra was quiet. She said, "Are you certain? The file is very clear. You were here on January 22nd at 2:30 in the afternoon. The receptionist at the time signed you in. Dr. Penrose saw you for approximately 40 minutes. The visit was billed to your provincial health card. The prescription that was being followed up on was for a sedative that Dr. Penrose had prescribed in December. I told her I had not been to the clinic in December either, as I told her I had no prescription for any sedative. Sandra asked me to hold. She was on hold for several minutes. She came back on the line. She said she had pulled the physical file from the records room. The file had my name on it. The file contained entries for a visit on December 14th and a follow-up visit on January 22nd. Both visits were documented with the standard intake forms, with my name and date of birth and provincial health card number filled in. The handwriting on the intake forms was not consistent across the two visits. The December form had been filled in by one person. The January form had been filled in by a different person. Both forms had the patient's signature at the bottom. The signatures were not identical, and they were similar but different in the way that two different people imitating a signature would produce different versions. I told Sandra that someone was using my identity to receive medical care at her clinic. I told her that I had not been to the clinic. I told her that the signatures on the forms were not mine. Sandra was quiet for a long moment. She said, "Margaret, I am going to need to get my supervisor involved in this conversation. I am going to ask you to come into the clinic in person with your provincial health card and a piece of photo identification so that we can verify your identity and document the discrepancy. I am also going to need to involve the RCMP, because if someone is using your health card to obtain prescriptions, that is a crime. Are you available to come in tomorrow?" I told her I was. I asked her, yet before we ended the call, whether the prescription that Dr. Penrose had given to whoever had used my name was something I should be concerned about. I asked her what the sedative was. She told me. The sedative was a controlled substance commonly prescribed for anxiety and insomnia. The prescription had been for a 30-day supply. The follow-up in January had renewed the prescription for an additional 30 days. I asked her whether the patient had picked up the prescriptions. She said yes. The pharmacy attached to the clinic had filled both prescriptions. The patient had collected the December prescription on December 14th, immediately after the appointment, and had collected the January prescription on January 22nd, immediately after the follow-up appointment. I asked her where the pharmacy was located, and she said it was in the same building as the clinic, on the ground floor. I asked her whether the pharmacy had a record of the person who had collected the prescriptions. She said yes. The pharmacy required identification at the time of pickup for controlled substances. The pharmacist would have verified the identity of the person collecting against the prescription. The pharmacy's records would show the date and time of the pickup and the form of identification that had been presented. I asked her if she could check what identification had been presented. Sandra was quiet for several seconds. She said, "I am going to ask the pharmacist to pull the records for both pickups. I am going to call you back this afternoon. I want to verify what I am about to tell you before I tell you. Can you wait for my call?" I told her I could. She called me back at 3 in the afternoon. She had spoken with the pharmacist. The pharmacist had pulled the records. The identification that had been presented at both pickups had been my provincial health card. The pharmacist had a clear memory of both pickups. The pharmacist described the patient as a woman in her late 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair, of average height and build, with a small mole on the left side of her chin. I drove to the clinic the next morning. The drive took just over 2 hours on the winter roads. I arrived at the clinic at 10 in the morning. Sandra met me at the reception desk. She brought her supervisor, a woman named Patricia Vance, who introduced herself as the clinic administrator. The three of us went into a small conference room near the back of the building. Patricia had pulled both of the file entries that Sandra had described to me on the phone. She also had a printed log from the pharmacy showing the prescription pickups. She had a small recording device on the table, which she asked permission to use. She told me she wanted to document the conversation in case the matter became a formal investigation. I gave my permission. Patricia asked me to verify my identity. I gave her my driver's license and my provincial health card. As she compared the cards to the records in my file, the numbers matched. The photograph on my driver's license matched my appearance. The signature on my driver's license did not match the signatures on the December and January intake forms. Patricia asked me to write my signature on a blank piece of paper. I wrote it. She compared my signature to the ones on the forms. She told me, in her professional opinion, that the signatures on the forms were not mine. She said the signatures on the forms had been written by someone who had seen my signature and had attempted to copy it, but who had not produced a convincing match. She said the discrepancy would have been visible to any pharmacist or receptionist who had compared the signatures carefully, but that pharmacists and receptionists in busy clinics did not always compare signatures carefully, particularly for routine prescription pickups. Patricia asked me about my whereabouts on December 14th and January 22nd. I gave her the dates and times of postal transactions I had processed at the post office on both days. The December 14th transactions included a registered letter that had been sent at 2:47 in the afternoon, which was during the same window as the supposed clinic appointment. The January 22nd transactions included a series of money order processings between 1:30 and 3:15 in the afternoon, which overlapped completely with the supposed appointment time. I gave her the transaction reference numbers. I told her she could verify the transactions through the Federal Mail Service if she wanted to. Patricia made notes. She told me she would file a formal report with the RCMP. She told me she would ask the RCMP to investigate the case as identity theft and prescription fraud. She told me the investigation would likely involve interviews with Dr. Penrose, the pharmacist, the receptionist, and possibly with me as the victim. She told me to expect contact from the RCMP within the next few weeks. I asked Patricia whether the clinic had any video surveillance that might have captured the patient who had used my name. She told me the clinic had cameras at the main entrance, in the waiting area, and at the pharmacy counter. The cameras retained footage for 90 days before the recordings were overwritten. The December 14th appointment was outside the retention window. The January 22nd appointment was within the window. She would pull the footage and would make a copy available to the RCMP and, if I requested, to me. I asked her if I could see the January 22nd footage before I left. She agreed. We walked to a small office where a security computer was located. She pulled up the recording from the main entrance camera at approximately 2:25 in the afternoon on January 22nd, which was about 5 minutes before the appointment was scheduled. We waited and watched. A woman walked through the main entrance at 2:27 p.m. The woman was alone. She was wearing a dark blue parka with the hood down. She had shoulder-length brown hair. She was of average height and build. The camera angle did not allow me to see her face clearly. She walked to the reception desk and handed something to the receptionist. Yeah, the receptionist appeared to look up the patient's information on her computer. The receptionist nodded and gestured toward the waiting area. The woman moved out of the camera's range, presumably to sit in the waiting area. Patricia switched to the camera in the waiting area. The woman entered the frame and sat down in a chair against the back wall. The chair faced the camera. The lighting was good. The woman was visible. The woman was me. I want to be precise about what I mean by that. The woman in the recording was identical to me, in every visible detail, by my own observation watching the recording. She was the same height as me, the same build, the same hair color and style. She was wearing clothing that I owned, specifically a dark blue parka that I had purchased in late October from the general store in Glenmore. The parka had a small tear on the right sleeve that I had repaired with a patch. The patch was visible in the recording. The woman in the recording had my face. She had my mole on the left side of her chin. She moved the way I move. She sat the way I sit. She had a habit, when waiting, of crossing her ankles in a particular way that I have done my whole life, and she was doing it in the recording. Patricia did not say anything as we watched. The recording continued for about 10 minutes until a nurse came to the waiting area and called out a name. The woman stood up and followed the nurse out of the camera's range. Patricia paused the recording. Patricia said, "Margaret, I have known you for less than a day. I do not know you well. I am going to ask you something, and I am going to ask you to be honest with me." Now, the woman in the recording could be you. The clothing matches, the physical appearance matches, the mannerisms appear to match. I have to consider the possibility that you came to this clinic on January 22nd, that you used your real identification, that you obtained the prescription, and that you are now trying to claim you did not, for some reason that I do not understand. I am asking you to tell me directly whether the woman in the recording is you. I told her the woman in the recording was not me. I told her I understood why she had to ask. I told her I had records that proved I was at the post office at the same time the woman was at the clinic. I told her I would provide whatever additional documentation was needed to demonstrate that I had been in two places at once was not physically possible, and that the woman in the recording, however much she resembled me, was a different person. Patricia nodded. She told me she believed me, but that the case would be unusually difficult to investigate because of the resemblance. She told me the RCMP would have their own questions and their own approach. She told me to be patient with the process. I left the clinic that afternoon with a printed copy of the still image of the woman in the waiting area, taken from the surveillance recording. I had asked for the image because I wanted to be able to look at it carefully when I was alone. I drove back to Glenmore. I arrived at the post office in the early evening, and I opened the post office for the last hour of business hours that day. I processed 2 transactions for residents who had come in to mail packages. I closed the post office at 6 p.m. I went up to my apartment. I sat at the kitchen table with the printed image. I looked at it for a long time. The woman in the image was me. I could not, by any honest evaluation of the image, distinguish her from myself. The image was the kind of image that, if I had been shown it without context, I would have assumed was a photograph of me that I had forgotten being taken. I added the events of the day to my notebook. I described the meeting with Patricia and Sandra. I described the surveillance footage. I taped the printed image into the notebook on a fresh page. I wrote beneath the image, "The woman in the recording is identical to me, and either I am suffering from a serious dissociative condition that has caused me to travel to the clinic without remembering, or there is another woman in this region who is, by every visible measure, identical to me, and who has access to my clothing and to my identification. I cannot determine which of these explanations is correct. I am going to consult a doctor about the dissociative possibility. I am going to ask Reginald Coombs and Donald Pettigrew for any further information they might have about the woman they have seen. I want to skip ahead to the next significant entry in the notebook, which is from late February. The dissociative possibility had been investigated by that point and had been ruled out. I had driven back to the clinic in mid-February for a thorough neurological and psychological evaluation. The evaluation had included a brain scan, a battery of cognitive tests, and a series of interviews with both Dr. Penrose and a visiting psychiatrist who came to the clinic monthly. The conclusions of the evaluation had been that I was not suffering from any condition that would cause dissociative episodes or fugue states. My cognitive function was normal. My memory was intact. The brain scan had shown no abnormalities. The psychiatrist had told me that I was, by every measure available to her, a mentally healthy woman who had been through significant grief in the past year, but who was managing the grief in a healthy way. The dissociative explanation, having been ruled out, left only the alternative explanation. The alternative explanation was that there was another woman in the region who was identical to me, who had access to my clothing and identification, and who had been visiting Glenmore and the surrounding area for at least 5 months, possibly longer. The next entry in the notebook is from February 27th. The entry describes a visit Reginald Coombs paid to me at the post office. Reginald did not normally come to the post office on days other than Tuesday. He came on a Wednesday in the late morning. He came in, looked around to make sure no other customers were present, and asked if he could speak with me privately. I closed the post office for 15 minutes. We went into the back office. Reginald sat down across from me at the small desk where I did my paperwork. He said, "Margaret, I want to tell you something I have been thinking about for the past 2 months. I should have told you sooner. I have been thinking about whether telling you would do more harm than good. I have decided to tell you." I told him to go ahead. He said, "I have lived in this area for 40 years. I have known the previous postmasters going back a long time. Eileen was the postmaster for 23 years before she retired. Before Eileen, there was a man named Roderick McAllister, who had been the postmaster for about 15 years. Before Roderick, there was a woman named Helen Krause, who had been the postmaster for about 10 years. The post office has been in continuous operation since the building was constructed in 1962. He paused. He said, "I want to tell you that, in the years I have known the postmasters in Glenmore, I have observed something that I have never been able to explain. The observation is that, at certain points during each postmaster's tenure, there has been someone else in the community who looked like the postmaster. The someone else has been seen by various residents over the years. The someone else has not always been seen by the postmaster themselves. The someone else has been quiet, has not interfered with anyone's life in any obvious way, and has eventually stopped being seen." He continued, "I observed it with Helen Krause. There was a woman who looked like Helen who came into the area in the 2nd year of Helen's tenure. The woman was seen by several residents, including me. The woman appeared to be a relative of Helen's, perhaps a sister. Helen never mentioned having a sister. The woman was seen for about a year and then was not seen again. Yet Helen continued as the postmaster for another 9 years, and the woman was never seen again during that time." He continued, "I observed it with Roderick McAllister. There was a man who looked like Roderick who came into the area in Roderick's 3rd year. The man was seen by several residents. The man appeared to be Roderick. The residents who saw him assumed Roderick was running errands when he was supposed to be at the post office. The man was seen for about 18 months and then was not seen again. Roderick continued as the postmaster for another 12 years. He continued, I observed it with Eileen Drysdale. There was a woman who looked like Eileen who came into the area in Eileen's 4th year. The woman was seen by several residents, including me. The woman was seen for about 2 years and then was not seen again. As Eileen continued as the postmaster for another 17 years, he paused. He said, I am observing it now with you. The woman who has been seen in the community by me, by Donald Pettigrew, and by however many other people have seen her without mentioning it, is the woman who matches the pattern I have observed with the previous 3 postmasters. The pattern has been consistent across 40 years and 4 postmasters. I do not have an explanation for the pattern. I have been waiting and watching for it to repeat each time a new postmaster has been hired. It has repeated each time. I sat at the desk and I tried to absorb what Reginald was telling me. I asked him whether he had ever discussed the pattern with the previous postmasters. He said, I discussed it with Helen Krause once, near the end of her tenure, and she told me she had seen the woman herself on several occasions, always at a distance, always in places where Helen had not been. She told me she had decided not to investigate, on the theory that investigating would likely cause more problems than it would solve. She told me the woman had stopped being seen after about a year and had not been seen again for the rest of Helen's tenure. She told me she was glad she had not investigated because the absence of the woman had allowed her to continue working at the post office without the constant sense that she was being followed by something she could not understand. He continued, I discussed it with Roderick McAllister once, similarly near the end of his tenure. He gave me a similar answer. He had seen the man himself on a few occasions. He had decided not to investigate. Yet the man had stopped being seen after about a year and a half. Roderick had continued at the post office for many years afterward without further incident. He continued, I discussed it with Eileen Drysdale once. I did not get a similar answer. Eileen told me she had not seen the woman herself, although she had heard about the sightings from others. Eileen told me she had decided to ignore the situation entirely. She told me she did not want to know about it. She told me she had specifically asked the residents who had mentioned the sightings to stop mentioning them, because hearing about them was distressing to her, and she did not see what good could come of discussing them. He continued, I am telling you about the pattern because I think you have a right to know. Much I think the previous postmasters made different decisions about how to handle the pattern. Helen and Roderick acknowledged it and chose not to investigate. Eileen refused to acknowledge it. I do not know which approach is the right one. I am giving you the information so that you can make your own choice. I am also telling you because, by my observation, the woman who has been seen in your case has been more active than the equivalent figures in the previous cases. The previous figures were seen at distances, in passing, in brief encounters. They did not, as far as I am aware, impersonate the postmasters or use their identification or interact with institutions in a way that affected the postmaster's life. The woman in your case has done these things by what you have told me about the clinic. The pattern in your case appears to be different from the previous patterns in ways that concern me. I asked Reginald what he thought I should do. He said, I do not know. I have been trying to think about it. I have not been able to arrive at a clear answer. I have wondered whether the difference in your case is related to something specific about you, or about the circumstances of your hiring, or about the current period that we are in. I have wondered whether the previous postmaster's decisions to ignore or to acknowledge the pattern made a difference in how the pattern unfolded. I have wondered whether anything any of the postmasters did had any effect at all, or whether the pattern simply does what it does, regardless of the postmaster's responses. I do not have an answer. I have only the observations. I asked him whether the previous figures, the woman who looked like Helen, and the man who looked like Roderick, and the woman who looked like Eileen, had ever been identified or explained. I asked him whether the residents had ever come to any conclusion about who or what the figures were. He said, no, the figures were never identified. The residents discussed the figures occasionally in private conversations among themselves. There were various theories. Some people thought the figures were relatives of the postmasters who had visited and had been mistaken for the postmasters themselves. Some people thought the figures were ordinary visitors to the area who happened to resemble the postmasters by coincidence. Some people thought there was something unusual about the post office itself, that the building or the position somehow attracted or generated the figures. None of the theories were ever confirmed. The figures stopped being seen in each previous case before any investigation had reached a conclusion. I asked Reginald whether he was willing to write down what he had told me. I told him I wanted to have a written record of his observations in case the situation continued to escalate, and I needed to provide documentation to the RCMP or to anyone else who became involved. He agreed. He took a few minutes to write a summary on a piece of paper I provided. The summary was about a page long. It described the pattern across the 4 postmasters in the same general terms he had described to me. He signed and dated the summary. He gave it to me. I added it to my folder. He left. As I closed the post office for the rest of the day, I went up to my apartment. I sat at the kitchen table. I tried to think about what I had been told. The pattern Reginald had described raised the situation to a different level of significance than the previous information had suggested. The situation was not unique to me. The situation had been occurring at the Glenmore post office for at least 40 years, with each successive postmaster apparently being accompanied by a figure who resembled them and who had been seen by various residents over the years. The figures had varied in their behaviors. The figure in my case was, by Reginald's assessment, more active and more invasive than the figures in the previous cases. I considered what to do. I considered whether to report Reginald's observations to the RCMP, who were already investigating the clinic incident. I decided not to. The RCMP were investigating a specific case of identity theft and prescription fraud. The pattern Reginald had described was the kind of information that would, if I included it in my statement, make my account seem less credible rather than more. I decided to keep Reginald's information in my private records and to share it with the RCMP only if it became directly relevant. I considered whether to contact Eileen Drysdale again. I had not spoken with Eileen since our second phone call in February, when she had failed to call me back after our discussion of the calendar entry. I considered whether to drive to her town and try to speak with her in person. I considered whether asking her about the figure that had been seen during her own tenure, which Reginald had described, would be useful. I decided to wait. I decided I would not contact Eileen unless something specific happened that required her input. I decided to focus, for the time being, on the pattern in my own case, and on the question of whether the figure who had been impersonating me was going to continue to impersonate me, and what the impersonation might lead to. The next significant entry in the notebook is from March 15th. The entry describes a visit I received from an RCMP officer named Constable Anders Gillespie, who had been assigned to the clinic case. Constable Gillespie came to the post office on a Wednesday afternoon. He was in his 40s, in uniform, professional in his manner. He had driven up from the regional detachment about 300 kilometers south of Glenmore. So he had been investigating the clinic case for about 3 weeks by the time he came to see me. He had interviewed Dr. Penrose, the pharmacist, the receptionist who had checked in the patient on January 22nd, and Patricia Vance. He had reviewed the surveillance footage. He had been working on identifying the woman in the footage through various means available to the RCMP, including running her image through facial recognition databases that had access to provincial driver's license photographs. He came to the post office to update me on the investigation and to ask me some additional questions. We sat in the back office. I closed the public area for the duration of his visit. Constable Gillespie told me that the facial recognition search had not produced any matches other than my own photograph. The woman in the surveillance footage had, followed by the algorithm's analysis, the same face as me. The algorithm had not identified any other person in the database who matched her features. The algorithm had treated her, in effect, as me. He told me this was unusual. He said facial recognition algorithms could sometimes produce false matches, or could fail to identify a person who was in the database, or could produce ambiguous results when comparing similar faces. He said he had not previously encountered a case where the algorithm had positively identified a person who, by the available evidence, could not have been the person it had identified. He said the technical specialists who had run the search had told him the result was, by their professional assessment, one of 2 possibilities. The first possibility was that the woman in the footage was, in fact, me, and that the records showing my whereabouts at the time were either fabricated or incorrect. The second possibility was that the woman in the footage was a person who was, by some combination of genetic similarity and physical resemblance, sufficiently identical to me to fool the algorithm. Constable Gillespie told me he was inclined to investigate the second possibility further before drawing any conclusions about the first. He told me he had been researching whether I had any biological siblings, half-siblings, or other close relatives who might resemble me sufficiently to account for the situation. He had checked my birth records and the birth records of my parents. He had not found any indication of siblings or other close relatives. He asked me whether I had been adopted. Yet he asked whether my parents might have given up a sibling for adoption before or after my birth. He asked whether there was any possibility of an unknown twin. I told him I had not been adopted. I told him my parents had been together since their early 20s and had no children other than me. I told him my mother had died of cancer when I was 23, and my father had died of a heart attack when I was 31. I told him I had no surviving close relatives to consult about any unknown family history. I told him I had no reason to believe I had a twin. Constable Gillespie told me he would continue investigating. He told me he was also looking into the possibility that the woman in the footage was using prosthetics or makeup to deliberately impersonate me. Although he said this seemed unlikely given the precision of the resemblance and the difficulty of matching the small details like the mole on my chin. He told me he was also looking into the possibility that the case was related to other unsolved identity-related crimes in the region, although he had not found any obvious connections. He asked me if I had any additional information that might be relevant to the investigation. He asked me if there had been any other unusual events in my life since I had moved to Glenmore that might be related. I considered what to tell him. I considered whether to mention Reginald's observations about the pattern across the previous postmasters. I considered whether to mention Eileen's calendar entry or Donald's sightings. I decided to mention some of it, but not all of it. And I told Constable Gillespie that there had been at least 2 other people in Glenmore who had reported seeing a woman who matched my appearance in the area, going back to the period before I had officially arrived in October. I gave him Reginald's name and Donald's name. I told him both of them were willing to speak with him. I told him their accounts had matching descriptions of the woman, including the detail of the mole on the chin. I did not mention Reginald's observations about the pattern across the previous postmasters. I decided I would mention that only if Constable Gillespie's own investigation led him to ask about it. Constable Gillespie made notes. He thanked me for the names. He told me he would interview Reginald and Donald in the next few days. He told me he would update me on the investigation as it progressed, and that he told me to continue documenting any further incidents and to call him directly if anything else happened that I thought might be relevant. He gave me his card. He left. I sat in the back office for a while after he had gone. I tried to think about what I had told him and what I had not told him. I had given him information that pointed toward the existence of a real other person who had been impersonating me. I had not given him information that might have suggested a more complicated explanation. I had made a judgment that the simpler explanation was the one that would be most productive for the investigation, and that the more complicated information could be added later if the investigation moved in a direction that called for it. I have been thinking in the months since about whether that judgment was correct, and I have not been able to decide. I have continued to provide Constable Gillespie with information about subsequent incidents as they have occurred. I have continued to withhold the broader pattern that Reginald had described. I want to tell you about the next significant event, which is from early April. The next event was the first time I saw the figure myself. It was a Saturday morning. The post office was closed on Saturdays during the winter months, when the volume of mail was low enough that the Federal Mail Service had authorized reduced operating hours. I had used the morning to drive to a small lake about 20 kilometers north of Glenmore. The lake was a place I had been going on weekends since I had arrived, when the weather permitted. It was a quiet spot. There was a small pull-off on the road where I could park, and a short trail down to the water. I went to the lake to walk along the shore and to think. I had been at the lake for about an hour. I had walked the length of the shoreline that was accessible, which was perhaps half a kilometer in each direction from the trail. I had been alone, as I always was when I went to the lake. There was no other vehicle in the pull-off, yet I had not seen anyone else on the trail or along the shore. I was walking back toward the trail when I saw a woman standing on the shore about 100 meters ahead of me. The woman was facing the lake with her back to me. She was wearing a dark blue parka, the same parka I was wearing, the parka that had been visible in the surveillance footage at the clinic in January. She had shoulder-length brown hair. She was of average height and build. She was standing very still. I stopped walking. I stood on the trail and I watched her. She did not turn. She did not move. She continued to face the lake. The wind was coming off the water and was blowing her hair slightly. She stood for what was probably about 2 minutes without any visible movement other than the wind moving her hair. I want to tell you what I did. I did not call out to her. I did not approach her. I considered both of these actions and rejected them. I had been thinking, for the previous month, about what I would do if I encountered the figure directly. I had decided, in the abstract, that I would try to communicate with her, to ask her questions, to attempt to understand what she was and what she wanted. I had decided this in the abstract, in the safety of my apartment above the post office, where the figure had been a concept rather than a presence. Standing on the trail with the figure visible 100 meters away, I found that my abstract decisions did not survive contact with the actual situation. I did not want to communicate with her. I did not want to approach her. I wanted to leave. I turned around quietly and I walked back along the trail in the direction I had come from, and away from the figure and away from my car. I walked for about 10 minutes until I reached the far end of the shoreline where the trail ended at a small rocky outcropping. I stood at the outcropping and I tried to think about what to do. I needed to get back to my car, which was at the trailhead, which was in the direction I had been walking when I had seen the figure. I needed to pass the spot where the figure had been standing, or close to it, in order to reach my car. I waited. I did not know what I was waiting for. I waited for perhaps 30 minutes. I tried to be quiet. I sat on a rock at the outcropping, and I watched the trees. The morning was cold. I was glad I had worn my parka. After 30 minutes, I started walking back along the trail toward the trailhead. I walked slowly. I tried to make as little noise as possible, and I came around a bend in the trail that gave me a view of the section of shoreline where the figure had been standing. The figure was not there. The shore was empty. The lake was empty. There was no one in either direction along the trail. I walked the rest of the way to the trailhead. I reached the pull-off. My car was there. There was no other vehicle in the pull-off. There were no fresh footprints in the snow around the pull-off other than my own from when I had arrived. The figure had not driven to the lake. The figure had not left through the pull-off. By the physical evidence available, the figure had either walked to the lake from somewhere else or had not left through any of the standard paths. I got in my car. I drove back to Glenmore. I went to the post office. I went up to my apartment. I added the encounter to my notebook. I did not call Constable Gillespie. I did not have anything to report to him that would have been actionable. I had seen a figure who looked like me. The figure had not done anything other than stand on the shore. The figure had not approached me. The figure had not communicated with me. The figure had been gone when I had returned to look for her. There was no evidence I could provide other than my own observation, and my own observation, by the standards of any criminal investigation, was thin. I want to tell you about the next several weeks, because the next several weeks were the period during which the situation began to shift in a way that I am still trying to understand. After the encounter at the lake, I started seeing the figure more often. I do not mean that I encountered her directly again, although I did, twice more. But I mean that I started noticing her in peripheral ways. I would be at the post office counter, and I would see, through the window, a woman walking past on the road outside. Who would have my hair color and my build, and who would be wearing clothing similar to mine? I would look up, and the woman would be gone. I would be in my apartment, and I would hear footsteps on the staircase outside, and I would go to the window, and there would be no one there, and the snow on the staircase would have no fresh prints. I would be driving on the road between Glenmore and the regional center, and I would see, in my rearview mirror, a vehicle behind me that I did not recognize, with what appeared to be a single occupant who matched my general appearance. And the vehicle would maintain a distance behind me for a while, and would then turn off onto a side road, or would disappear at a curve. I was not sure, in any of these peripheral observations, that I was actually seeing the figure. I might have been seeing other women in the area who happened to share some of my characteristics. I might have been imagining things, in the heightened state of attention that the situation had produced. I could not, with the same confidence I had had at the lake, say that any of the peripheral observations had been the figure. The two direct encounters were, however, undeniable. The first was on April 18th. I was at the general store, picking up a few groceries. I was at the back of the store, looking at the canned goods. I heard the front door open. I heard footsteps come in, and I heard Donald greet the new customer. The new customer did not respond verbally. The footsteps moved through the store. They came toward the back, where I was. I looked up. The figure was at the end of the aisle. She was wearing a dark green sweater and jeans. Her hair was pulled back in a low ponytail. She was looking directly at me. She was about 10 feet away. I stood still. She stood still. We looked at each other for what was probably about 5 seconds. She was identical to me by every visible characteristic, except for the clothing. The dark green sweater was not a sweater I owned. The hairstyle was one I did not normally wear. The expression on her face was one I do not believe I have made on my own face. The expression was attentive, but not threatening. Yes, she was looking at me the way you look at a person you have been wanting to see for a long time and have finally found. She raised one hand slightly, in a small gesture that might have been a wave or might have been something else. She did not say anything. She turned around and walked back toward the front of the store. I heard her footsteps cross the store. I heard the front door open. I heard it close. I waited about 30 seconds before I moved. I walked to the front of the store. Donald was at the counter. He looked at me with an expression that I had not seen on his face before. He said, "Margaret, did that just happen?" I asked him what he meant. He said, "A woman came in. She walked to the back of the store. She came back to the front. She walked out without buying anything. The woman looked exactly like you. And the woman had your face." The woman did not say anything to me when I greeted her. I have been wondering for the past few months whether the woman I had been seeing was a relative of yours or someone who happened to look like you. I do not think she is either of those things. I do not know what she is. I do not know what to say. I told him I did not know either. I told him I had seen her for a few seconds in the back of the store and that she had looked at me and had then left. I told him I had been documenting the situation for several months and that I was working with the RCMP on it. Donald nodded. He told me he would be willing to give a statement to the RCMP if it would help. He gave me his cell phone number, which I already had, but he wrote it down for me again on a small piece of paper with a note that said, "Call any time. And I want to help." He told me he was sorry I was going through this. He told me he had known me for only 7 months, but that he had come to consider me a friend and that he would do whatever he could. I thanked him. I bought my groceries. I went home. The second direct encounter was 2 weeks later, on May 1st. I was in my apartment. It was approximately 9 in the evening. I was washing dishes at the kitchen sink. I heard a knock at the door of the apartment. The apartment had its own external door, accessed by the staircase on the side of the post office building. The door had a small window in the upper section. The window was at a height where I could see the upper part of a person standing on the landing outside, if they were of average height or taller. I went to the door. I looked through the window. Yet the figure was on the landing. She was standing about 3 feet from the door, facing me. She was wearing a dark coat that I did not recognize. Her hair was loose. She was looking at the window. When she saw me looking through the window, she did not move. She did not knock again. She simply stood and looked at me through the window. I did not open the door. I stood on the inside of the door, and I looked at her through the window. We looked at each other for what was probably about 30 seconds. She raised her hand to the level of her shoulder. She held it there. The gesture was, again, ambiguous. It could have been a wave. It could have been a request to come in. It could have been something else. She lowered her hand. She turned around and walked back down the staircase. I heard her footsteps descend. I heard the lower door, which opened onto the parking area beside the post office, open and close. I waited. I did not hear a vehicle start. I did not hear footsteps walking away. I waited for about 10 minutes. I did not look out any of the windows of the apartment. I sat at the kitchen table. I tried to breathe normally. After 10 minutes, I went to the kitchen window, which faced the parking area. The parking area was visible in the light from the post office's exterior lamp, which was on a timer and stayed on through the night. There was no one in the parking area. There were no vehicles other than my own. There were footprints in the snow leading from the bottom of the staircase to my car and stopping there. The footprints did not continue past my car. The figure had walked to my car and had stopped. The figure had not walked to any other location. As the figure was not visible anywhere in the parking area or on the road beyond it, I went back to the kitchen table. I added the encounter to my notebook. I did not call Constable Gillespie. I did not call Donald. I did not call anyone. I sat at the table for a long time. I eventually went to bed. I did not sleep well. The next morning, I went outside to look at the footprints in the snow. The footprints were still there. They were the same size and tread pattern as the boots I was wearing. The boots were the only winter boots I owned. The figure had been wearing boots that left identical tracks to mine. The footprints went from the bottom of the staircase to the driver's side of my car. They stopped there. There were no footprints leading away from the car. I unlocked my car. I opened the driver's side door. Yet if the interior of the car was as I had left it, there was no sign that anyone had been inside. The car was in the same condition as when I had parked it the previous evening. I closed the car door. I went back into the post office through the public entrance. I started my workday. I want to tell you about Reginald's death, because his death is the event that prompted me to record this account, and because his notebooks have provided the final layer of information that has shaped my understanding. Reginald died on a Thursday 2 weeks ago. He was found by his neighbor, a man named Lyle Mercer, who lived about 8 kilometers from Reginald's cabin. Lyle had been driving to the regional center for supplies and had passed Reginald's truck on the side of a logging road that branched off from the main highway. Yet Lyle had stopped because he knew Reginald and had wanted to check on him. He had found Reginald lying in the snow about 20 meters from the truck, near the entrance to a trail that led to one of his trapline sets. The cause of death, by the preliminary medical examination, was a heart attack. Reginald had been 67 years old. He had no known heart conditions, but men his age and his line of work were not uncommonly subject to sudden cardiac events. The death was ruled natural, and the case was closed without further investigation. I learned about Reginald's death the day after, when Lyle came to the post office to tell me. Lyle was in his 50s, a quiet man who came in once a week to collect his mail. He told me what had happened. He told me Reginald had been alone, that the death had appeared to be quick, that there had been no signs of distress beyond what would be normal for a sudden cardiac event. He told me a small memorial service was being planned for the following weekend. I attended the memorial service. About 30 people came, mostly residents of Glenmore and the surrounding area. The service was held at the community hall. There were no relatives of Reginald present. The priest from the regional center came up to officiate. The service was brief and dignified. After the service, Lyle came to me and told me that Reginald had named me as the recipient of his personal effects in a handwritten will that had been found in his cabin during the RCMP's brief investigation of the death. Lyle said the will was straightforward. Reginald had left his cabin and the land it was on to the Territorial Park Service, with the request that the cabin be either preserved as a historical structure or demolished at the Park Service's discretion. He had left his trapline equipment to a younger trapper in the area, a man named Donovan Fife. He had left his personal effects, which consisted primarily of his notebooks, his books, his small collection of photographs, and a few personal items, to me. I asked Lyle why Reginald had left the personal effects to me. Lyle said he did not know. He said he had spoken with Reginald a few weeks earlier and that Reginald had not mentioned anything about a will. Lyle said the will had been dated just before Reginald had died, only about a week earlier, which was unusual because most people would not write a will and then die so soon afterward. Lyle said the timing was a coincidence by the RCMP's assessment, but that he found the timing notable. The personal effects were delivered to the post office a few days after the memorial service. They came in 2 cardboard boxes. I took the boxes up to my apartment. I went through them carefully. The boxes contained Reginald's notebooks, going back about 30 years. They contained a small collection of books, mostly about trapping and natural history, which I have set aside to give to a library in the regional center. They contained a few photographs of Reginald with various people over the years, including some photographs of him with people I did not recognize, and some with people I had met in Glenmore. They contained a few personal items, including a pocket knife, a small compass, a pair of reading glasses, and a leather-bound journal that was different from the spiral-bound notebooks he had used for his trapline records. The journal was the item that has been most useful. The journal was about half full of handwritten entries. The entries were dated. The entries went back about 15 years. The entries were not daily entries. They were occasional entries that Reginald had made when he had wanted to record something that did not fit into his regular trapline notebooks. I have read the entire journal in the past week. I'm going to tell you what the journal contained that was relevant. The journal contained entries about Reginald's observations of the figures associated with the previous postmasters at Glenmore. The entries were more detailed than what Reginald had told me in his conversation with me in February. Yet the entries described specific encounters Reginald had had with the figures, including conversations he had had with the figures, which he had not mentioned to me. The entry from a date in 1997, during Roderick McAllister's tenure, described an encounter Reginald had had with the male figure who had resembled Roderick. The encounter had occurred at the same lake where I had encountered the figure who resembled me. The figure had been standing on the shore. Reginald had walked up to him and had spoken to him. The figure had spoken back. The figure had told Reginald that he was waiting. Reginald had asked what he was waiting for. The figure had told him that he was waiting for the postmaster to be ready. Reginald had asked what that meant. The figure had not answered. Reginald had left. The entry from a date in 2004. During Eileen Drysdale's tenure, described an encounter Reginald had had with the female figure who had resembled Eileen. The encounter had occurred in the parking area beside the post office in the early evening, when Reginald had been at the general store next door. The figure had been standing in the parking area. Reginald had walked up to her and had spoken to her. The figure had spoken back. The figure had told Reginald that she was waiting for Eileen to acknowledge her. Reginald had asked what would happen if Eileen acknowledged her. The figure had told him that she did not know because no postmaster had acknowledged her since she had become aware of the situation. Reginald had asked her how long she had been aware. The figure had told him that she did not know. Because the awareness was not the kind of thing that had a clear beginning, Reginald had left. The entries did not include any record of Reginald telling Roderick or Eileen about these encounters. The entries indicated that Reginald had decided to keep the encounters to himself, on the theory that telling the postmasters would not have been useful and might have made the situation worse for them. The entries from the past 7 months during my tenure described observations Reginald had made about the figure who resembled me. The entries described the figure's behavior in greater detail than Reginald had told me about. The figure, by Reginald's observations, had been more active than the previous figures. The figure had visited the post office building multiple times during periods when I had been away or asleep. By Reginald's observations from his cabin, which had a view of the post office building from a distance through binoculars, the figure had used the staircase to my apartment on at least 3 occasions that Reginald had observed before the May 1st knock. The figure had stood outside my apartment door for periods of 15 to 30 minutes on each of those occasions, without knocking, without making her presence known to me, without any apparent purpose other than to be present. The entries also described an encounter Reginald had had with the figure 2 days before he died. The encounter had occurred at his cabin. The figure had walked up to his cabin in the early evening and had knocked on the door. Reginald had answered. The figure had introduced herself as Margaret. The figure had told him that she was the postmaster of Glenmore, as if the figure had asked him whether he had been speaking with the actual Margaret, the one at the post office. Reginald had said yes. The figure had asked him what he and the actual Margaret had been discussing. Reginald had given a vague answer about the post office and routine matters. The figure had asked him whether he had been telling the actual Margaret about her. The figure, Reginald had said no. The figure had thanked him. The figure had told him that she appreciated his discretion. The figure had told him that the time was approaching when she would not need his discretion anymore. The figure had left. Reginald had written the entry the same evening in significant detail, including a careful note about the figure's exact words. The entry had ended with a final note that said, "I have been observing this pattern for 40 years. Yet the current figure is more active than any previous figure. The current figure has communicated with me in ways the previous figures did not. The current figure has indicated that something is approaching. I do not know what. I am going to write this down, and I am going to leave my journal for Margaret in my will. I am going to update my will tomorrow. I am going to make Margaret the recipient of my personal effects. I want her to have this journal. I want her to know what I have observed. I am going to write about this in my will so that the RCMP, if they investigate my death, will understand why I left my notebooks to her." Reginald died 2 days after that entry. The will, which was dated the day after the entry, named me as the recipient of his personal effects, including specifically his journal. Yet I sat in my apartment with the journal open in front of me, and I tried to think about what Reginald had been telling me. He had been telling me, in the journal, that the figure had been preparing for something. He had been telling me that the something was approaching. He had been telling me that the figure had been actively trying to keep him from communicating with me about her. He had been telling me, by the timing of his death, that he had decided to make sure I had access to the information regardless of what happened to him. I do not know whether Reginald's heart attack was related to the figure's visit to his cabin. The medical evidence supports the natural cause finding. The RCMP closed the case quickly. There is no investigative basis for connecting the two events. I am noting only that Reginald, by his own account, had received a visit from the figure in which the figure had made it clear that she did not want him communicating with me, and that 2 days later, Reginald had died of a heart attack at 67, an age at which heart attacks are common but not predictable. I have spent the past week thinking about what to do. I have made some decisions. I am going to tell you what they are. I have decided to leave the post office at the end of the current fiscal year, which ends on June 30th. I have already submitted my resignation to the Federal Mail Service. The federal office has accepted the resignation, They are advertising the position. They expect to hire a replacement within a few months, which is the standard timeline for remote postmaster positions. Yet I have decided to leave because I have concluded that the situation has progressed beyond what I can manage. The figure has become more active over the past 2 months. The figure has approached me directly. The figure has, by Reginald's evidence, been entering the building at times when I am not aware of her presence. The figure has communicated with at least one resident in a way that suggested an awareness of the situation that goes beyond simple impersonation. The figure is, by the language Reginald recorded, preparing for something. I do not want to be present when whatever the figure is preparing for occurs. I have decided to make my decision based on the available evidence rather than on faith in the historical pattern that Reginald had described. The historical pattern had suggested that the figures associated with previous postmasters had stopped being seen after a year or two and had not interfered significantly with the postmaster's tenures. The current figure does not match the historical pattern. The current figure is more active. The current figure is communicative. The current figure is approaching me directly. The current figure has, by Reginald's last entries, indicated that something is approaching. I have decided to weight the current evidence more heavily than the historical pattern, on the grounds that the current evidence is more relevant to my own situation. I have decided to leave Glenmore entirely. I am not going to take another position in the territories. I am going to move back south to a city where I can live in a building with other people, and where the patterns that have developed in Glenmore will, by my hope, not follow me. I do not know whether the figure is tied to the post office or to me. The historical pattern would suggest the figures were tied to the postmaster position rather than to the individual person, and that the figures had not followed the previous postmasters when they had left. I am hoping the historical pattern holds in this respect. I am also preparing for the possibility that it does not. I have decided to leave Reginald's journal and my own notebook at the post office in a sealed envelope addressed to the next postmaster, with a note explaining what the documents are and how I came to have them. The note will tell the next postmaster that they are free to read the documents or to ignore them, and that the documents are being left for their use if they need them. The note will include the contact information for Donald Pettigrew and for Lyle Mercer, both of whom are willing to talk with the next postmaster if asked. The note will include the contact information for Constable Gillespie in case the next postmaster experiences situations similar to mine and needs to make a report. I have decided not to include in the materials any explicit recommendation about what the next postmaster should do. I have decided that each postmaster has handled the situation differently, by Reginald's account, and that I do not have the standing to tell the next postmaster which approach to take. I have decided to provide the information and to let the next postmaster make their own choices. I have decided to record this account, in addition to leaving the materials because I want there to be a record outside of the post office that can be accessed by anyone who learns of the situation later. The materials I leave at the post office will be available only to the next postmaster, and only if the next postmaster chooses to read them. The recording will be available to anyone who comes across it. I want both kinds of access to exist. I have not yet finished the recording. I have one more part to record, which I will record after I have completed the move out of the apartment and after I have left Glenmore. I want to record the final part from a different location, after I have had time to see whether the figure follows me. I want the final part to include whatever happens during the move and whatever happens in the first weeks of my new life. I want to record it from a position of distance, if I can achieve that distance, because I think the distance will allow me to give a more honest assessment of where I have ended up and of what I have come to understand. I am going to stop recording for now. The The post office is closed for the day. I am in my apartment. The figure has not been seen by me or by anyone I have spoken with since the night of May 1st when she came to my door. The relative quiet of the past 2 weeks has not, by my interpretation, indicated that the situation has resolved. The relative quiet has, by my interpretation, indicated that the figure is waiting. I do not know what the figure is waiting for. I do not want to be present when the waiting ends. I left Glenmore on June 28th, 2 days before the official end of my contract. I had spent the previous week packing my belongings into the small trailer I had rented for the move. The Federal Mail Service had agreed to allow me to leave 2 days early because the new postmaster, a woman named Helena Brink, had arrived for her orientation week and had been able to take over the operations earlier than expected. I had spent 5 days with Helena, walking her through the routines of the post office and answering her questions. I had not told her about the figure. I had not told her about the materials I was leaving for her. I had decided that telling her in person would have been the wrong way to handle it. The materials would be there for her to discover on her own, yet the way Reginald's information had been made available to me on his own timeline. The morning I left, I went down to the post office before Helena arrived for her shift. I went into the back office. I opened the bottom drawer of the small desk where I had been keeping my own work materials. I placed the sealed envelope I had prepared in the drawer on top of a manila folder containing routine procedural documents. The envelope was labeled with Helena's name and a brief note that said, "For the new postmaster, please read when you have time." Inside the envelope were Reginald's journal, my own notebook, the printed image from the clinic surveillance footage, the descriptions Reginald and Donald had written, and a cover letter from me explaining what the materials were and where they had come from. Yet the cover letter was about 3 pages long. It was the most concise summary I could write of 7 months of observation. I had revised the letter several times to keep it factual and free of speculation. I closed the drawer. I left the post office. I went back up to the apartment. I gathered the last of my personal items. I locked the apartment. I went down to the parking area. I got in my car, which had the trailer attached to it. I drove away from Glenmore. I want to tell you what I noticed during the drive, because the drive was the first time I had been on the road for any significant distance since the figure had become active, and the drive was the test of whether the figure would follow me. The drive from Glenmore to the city where I had decided to relocate was approximately 3,000 kilometers, as if the route ran south through the Yukon into British Columbia, across the prairies, and into the city in central Canada, where I had grown up and where I still had a few distant friends. I had planned the route to take 6 days. I had booked motels along the way at moderate intervals. The first day of the drive was uneventful. I drove from Glenmore to a motel in Whitehorse, a distance of about 500 kilometers. The motel was a standard chain motel near the highway. I checked in. I had dinner at a restaurant attached to the motel. I went to bed. I slept reasonably well. The second day, I drove from Whitehorse to a motel in northern British Columbia. I noticed nothing unusual during the drive. I checked into the motel in the late afternoon. I had dinner. I went to bed. I slept poorly. I woke at approximately 3 in the morning. I did not know why I had woken. I lay in bed and listened. The motel was quiet. I could hear, occasionally, the sound of a vehicle on the highway outside. I could hear the hum of the heating system. I could hear nothing else. I got out of bed. I went to the window of the motel room. I parted the curtain about 1 inch. I looked out into the parking lot. The parking lot was lit by the standard motel security lighting. There were about a dozen vehicles in the lot. There was no one in the lot. I noticed on the far side of the lot, near the edge of the property where the lot met a small stretch of grass and trees, that there was a figure standing in the grass. The figure was about 30 meters from my window. The figure was facing the motel building. The figure was wearing dark clothing. The figure was of average height and build, and I could not see the figure's face clearly at that distance and in that lighting, but the figure had shoulder-length brown hair that was visible against the dark clothing. I closed the curtain. I went back to bed. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I did not look out the window again until morning. In the morning, I checked the area where the figure had been standing. There was no one there. The grass was wet with dew. There were no footprints in the grass. The grass was undisturbed. I checked out of the motel. I continued my drive. I want to tell you what I have decided about the figure at the motel. I have decided that the figure was the figure who had been at Glenmore. I have decided this because the timing of the appearance on the second night of my drive away from Glenmore suggested that the figure had been able to locate me at the motel. I have decided this because the description matched, although I had not been able to see the face clearly. I have decided this because the figure had been observing the motel building from a position of distance, in the same kind of waiting posture that the figure had used during the encounters in Glenmore. I have decided to be honest with you about the limitations of my conclusion. The figure at the motel could have been a different person. The motel was on a major highway. There were many travelers in the area. There could have been an unrelated woman who happened to be standing in the grass at 3 a.m. for reasons unrelated to my situation. The resemblance I observed could have been coincidental. Yet the fact that I had been actively watching for the figure could have produced false identification. I have decided to act on the assumption that the figure was the figure from Glenmore, while acknowledging that the assumption may not be correct. I have continued the drive with the assumption in mind. I have taken precautions during the remainder of the drive that I would not have taken if I had been confident the figure was confined to Glenmore. The third day, I drove from northern British Columbia to a motel in northern Alberta. I noticed nothing during the drive. I checked into the motel in the late afternoon. I asked for a room on an upper floor, on the side of the building facing the parking lot, where I would be able to see the parking lot from my window. I had dinner. I went to bed. I checked the parking lot through the window before I went to sleep. The parking lot was as I would expect a motel parking lot to be at night. There were no figures standing in the lot or in the surrounding area. I woke at approximately 3 a.m. I went to the window. The parking lot was as it had been when I had gone to sleep. There was no one in the lot. There was no one standing in the surrounding area. I went back to bed. I tried to sleep. I slept poorly, but managed to get a few more hours. The fourth day, I drove from northern Alberta to a motel in central Saskatchewan. The drive was long and the landscape was monotonous. I had a lot of time to think. I thought about Reginald. I thought about the figures that had been associated with the previous postmasters. And I thought about the historical pattern in which the figures had not, by Reginald's accounts, followed the previous postmasters when they had left their positions. I thought about the figure at the motel in northern British Columbia, which seemed to suggest that the historical pattern was not holding in my case. I considered, during the drive, the possibility that the figure at the motel had not been the figure from Glenmore, and that the historical pattern was holding, and that I was experiencing the kind of false identification that comes from being in a state of heightened anxiety. I considered this possibility and decided that I could not determine the truth of it from where I was. I would need to wait, to continue my journey, to see whether the figure appeared again before I could draw any conclusions. I checked into the motel in central Saskatchewan in the late afternoon. I asked for an upper floor room. I had dinner. I went to bed. I woke at approximately 3 in the morning. I went to the window. The figure was in the parking lot. The figure was standing about 20 meters from my window. The figure was facing the building. The figure was wearing dark clothing. The figure was at a closer distance than the figure at the previous motel had been. And the lighting at this motel was better. I could see the figure's face. The figure was me. The figure was identical to me, with the same precision as the figure I had encountered in the general store in Glenmore. I stood at the window and I looked at the figure. The figure looked at the window. The figure raised one hand to the level of her shoulder. The figure held the hand there. Now, the gesture was the same gesture the figure had made at the door of my apartment on May 1st. I closed the curtain. I sat on the bed. I tried to think. I have made a decision in the past few minutes that I want to record before I act on it. I am recording this final part of the account in the motel room on the 4th night of my drive, immediately after seeing the figure in the parking lot. I am recording it now because I want the recording to exist before I make the decision concrete, in case the decision turns out badly. I have decided that I am going to continue the drive to my destination. I have decided that I am going to take whatever precautions I can. I have decided that I am going to assume the figure is going to continue to follow me. Now, I have decided that I am going to live my life with the assumption that the figure is a permanent feature of my existence, in the same way that some people live with chronic medical conditions or with persistent threats from people who have stalked them. I have decided that I am going to try to find out, over time, what the figure wants, and whether there is any way to address what the figure wants that does not require me to do something I am not willing to do. I have decided not to return to Glenmore. I have decided not to ask Helena Brink whether the figure is still appearing at the post office. I have decided not to stay in contact with anyone in Glenmore, including Donald, Lyle, and the others I had come to know. I have decided to make a clean break from Glenmore and to start over in the city. I have decided to make these choices because I do not believe returning to Glenmore would resolve the situation, and I do not want to drag the people in Glenmore into whatever is happening to me. I have decided that the people in Glenmore have their own lives, and that my situation is no longer something they need to be involved in. I have decided to keep documenting what happens. I have decided to maintain a notebook in my new life, in the same way I maintain the notebook at the post office, and to record any further encounters with the figure or any further developments in the situation. I have decided that the documentation may be useful at some point in the future, either to me or to someone else who finds it. I have decided to share this recording with no one, for now. I have decided to keep it as a private record, stored on a hard drive that I will keep in a safe location. I have decided that I will share it only if circumstances change in ways that make sharing useful. I have decided that the recording is a kind of insurance, in case something happens to me that requires explanation. I want to tell you, finally, what I have come to think about the figure, after 7 months of observing her in Glenmore and 4 nights of being followed by her on this drive. I want to be honest about the limits of my understanding. I do not know what the figure is. I do not know whether the figure is a separate entity that resembles me, or whether the figure is some kind of projection of myself that has acquired independent existence, or whether the figure is something else entirely that I do not have the framework to describe. And I have considered all of these possibilities. I have not been able to choose between them. What I have come to think is that the figure represents a pattern that has been operating at the Glenmore post office for at least 40 years, and possibly longer by Reginald's account. The pattern has, in each previous case, produced a figure that resembled the postmaster and that was observed by the residents of the community. The pattern has, in each previous case, eventually become quiescent by Reginald's accounts within a few years of the postmaster's tenure beginning. The current iteration of the pattern, in my case, has been more active and more invasive than the previous iterations, for reasons I do not understand. I have come to think that the figure has, by some mechanism I cannot identify, the ability to operate in places other than Glenmore when the postmaster leaves the position. The historical pattern would have predicted that the figure would not follow me. The historical pattern, by my observation in the past 4 nights, has not held. The reasons for the deviation from the historical pattern are not available to me. I have come to think that the figure, whatever else she is, has been patient. She has waited for years in the previous cases without taking actions that significantly affected the postmaster's lives. She has waited for months in my case, with gradually increasing activity that suggested, by Reginald's records, that she was approaching some kind of culmination. The culmination has not yet occurred, by my own observation. She has not, on any of the occasions when she has appeared to me directly, taken any action that I would describe as harmful. She has stood, she has watched, she has gestured. She has not spoken to me. She has not approached me beyond the distances I have described. She has not, as far as I can determine, attempted to harm me. I have come to think that the figure is waiting for something specific. I do not know what. The figure who spoke to Reginald in 2004, during Eileen's tenure, told him she was waiting for Eileen to acknowledge her. The figure who spoke to Reginald in 1997, during Roderick's tenure, told him he was waiting for the postmaster to be ready. I have not asked my own figure what she is waiting for, because I have not spoken to her, because the encounters have been brief and have not provided opportunities for conversation, and because I have been afraid of what the conversation might involve. Now, I have considered, in the past few weeks, that I might eventually need to speak with her in order to understand the situation. I have not yet done so. I am not yet willing to do so. I do not know whether I will ever be willing. I want to tell you what I have decided to do over the next year, because the year is the period during which I expect to have either resolved the situation or to have learned to live with it. I am going to continue the drive to my destination. I am going to arrive at my new apartment in 2 more days. I am going to settle in. I am going to look for work in the city, probably in some kind of administrative or clerical position that will not require me to be alone in a remote location. I am going to live in an apartment in a building with many other residents, where the figure's appearances, if they continue, will be visible to me and to others. I am going to try to develop a normal life. I am going to try to start over. I am going to document any further appearances of the figure. I am going to add to my notebook. I am going to keep the documentation private in the same way I have kept the present recording private. I am going to consider if the figure continues to appear and if the appearances do not escalate beyond the kind of waiting and watching she has been doing, whether to attempt to communicate with her. I have not made a decision about this. I am going to wait to see how the situation develops before I commit to a decision. I am going to consider, if the figure does escalate, whether to involve law enforcement again. The investigation that Constable Gillespie was conducting is, as far as I am aware, still open. And the investigation has not, in the months since I first met with him, produced any further leads. The facial recognition algorithm continues to identify the woman in the surveillance footage as me. The investigators have been unable to identify any other person who could account for the appearances. The investigation has been, by my last update from Constable Gillespie, in a state of stagnation. I do not expect law enforcement to be useful if the figure continues to appear in the city. I am noting the option only because I want to be honest about the range of options I am considering. I am going to consider, if the situation becomes unmanageable, whether to leave the city and try a different location. I am hoping I will not need to do this. I am acknowledging that I might. I want to give some final thoughts to whoever might eventually hear this recording. I want to acknowledge that the recording is unusual, that the events I have described are not the kind of events that fit easily into ordinary categories of explanation, and that I would not blame a listener for being skeptical. I have been skeptical of my own observations throughout the past 7 months. I have considered repeatedly that I might be experiencing some kind of psychological condition that has produced the appearances and the contradictions. I have had medical evaluations that have ruled out the most obvious possibilities. I have not been able to rule out all possibilities. I am open to the possibility that some part of what I have described is the product of my own mind rather than of external events. But what I am not open to is the possibility that all of it is the product of my own mind. The accounts from Eileen, from Reginald, from Donald, from the dispatcher, Sandra, from the pharmacist whose statements were collected by Constable Gillespie, are independent of my own perception. The surveillance footage is independent of my own perception. The signature analysis is independent of my own perception. The footprints in the snow at my apartment are independent of my own perception. The notebook entries that Reginald maintained over years are independent of my own perception. The combination of these independent sources points towards something that exists outside of my own mind, even if I do not have a framework for describing what that something is. I want to give the listener, if there is a listener, the same advice I would give to anyone who finds themselves in a situation that resembles mine. The advice is brief. Document everything. Talk to other witnesses when you can. Be careful about who you tell. Consider that the situation may not respond to investigation and may not be possible to resolve through ordinary means. Consider that the situation may be something you have to learn to live with rather than something you can defeat or escape. Consider that other people may have lived through similar situations, and that their experiences may be available to you if you can find them. Consider that you may, at some point, be the source from which someone else learns about a situation similar to yours. Be honest about what you know and what you do not know. I want to mention one final thing. I have been thinking, over the past few days, about Reginald's last entry in his journal. The entry described the figure visiting him at his cabin and indicating that something was approaching. Reginald died 2 days later of a heart attack while running his trap line. The cause of death was natural by every medical assessment. There was no evidence of any external cause. The timing was a coincidence by every reasonable standard. I have been thinking about the timing because it has occurred to me that if the figure has the ability to follow me from Glenmore to a motel in central Saskatchewan, she may have the ability to do other things that I have not been able to verify. I have been thinking about whether Reginald's death was, in some way I cannot prove, related to his communication with me. I have not been able to convince myself either way if the natural cause of death is the most likely explanation. The timing is the kind of timing that makes me hesitate. I am noting this because I want the listener, whoever they are, to consider that the situations like the one I have described may have consequences for people who become involved in them, beyond the consequences for the primary affected person. Reginald may have died of a heart attack that would have happened anyway. He may have died because his heart, after 67 years of work in difficult conditions, simply gave out at a moment that happened to coincide with the figure's visit. The medical evidence supports this interpretation. I am noting only that I am not certain. If I die in the months or years to come of natural causes, please consider that the natural causes may be exactly what they appear to be. Please also consider that the natural causes may not be the whole story. Please look for the recording that I have stored, which will be in a safe deposit box at a bank in the city where I am about to settle, with instructions in my will for the recording to be released to a specific person if anything happens to me. The specific person is a journalist whose contact information I have included in my will. The journalist does not know about the recording yet. The journalist will receive the recording only if my death triggers the release. I want to stop recording now. The motel room is quiet. The figure is not visible from the window, although I have not looked again since I began recording. The drive to the new city continues in the morning. I am going to try to sleep for a few more hours before I have to be back on the road. I am going to lock the door and chain it. I am going to set my alarm. I am going to attempt to live whatever life I have left, in whatever conditions I find myself in, for as long as I am able to. The figure is, by my best guess, going to continue to be present. The figure is, by my best guess, going to continue to wait for whatever she has been waiting for. I do not know what the waiting is for. I do not know whether the waiting will end. I do not know whether the ending of the waiting will involve me in any direct way, or whether the waiting will simply continue indefinitely, with the figure as a constant presence at the edges of my life. I am going to learn to live with the presence. I do not have a choice. The choice was made by some mechanism I do not understand when I accepted the postmaster position at Glenmore, as so the choice was confirmed in some sense when the figure followed me out of Glenmore and onto the road. The choice cannot now be unmade. I can only choose how to respond to the conditions I find myself in. I am going to stop recording. The recording is over.